Is Nana Ama Sarfo. I'm a contributing editor with Tax Notes International, and I am today's moderator. We have a very robust roundtable planned where you will hear from several experts. And then after that, we will have a question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box below, and we will pull them up for the Q&A session a bit later. And I also wanted to note that we are streaming today in 4 different languages. We have English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. So if you look toward the bottom of your screen, there is an interpretation button and you can select the best option. So with that, we'll start with some opening remarks from Dereje Alemayu, and he is the executive coordinator for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. So Dereje, great to have you today.
Thank you, Nana. And first of all, thank you very much for accepting our request to moderate this session. I'm given a ceremonial role. The work to organize this webinar and the remaining Global Days of Action activities has been capably organized by my colleagues, Caroline, Lais, and Grazie. And they just looked at my age and asked me to open the session. We are, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice is a coalition of 5 autonomous tax justice networks in Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, and Europe. And we have a very small coordination office because most of the activities are run by our member organizations. We have, at the country level, our members are active to see that taxes are just and fair, tax systems are progressive and redistributive, and we at the global level try to coordinate campaigns for a more equitable and representative international tax governance, which is now biased in favor of rich countries. And in addition to working with our regional members, we also try to organize international global working groups, especially to have to work with others who are not directly in the tax justice movement, because there is a series of intersections between justice movements and tax. And the feminist movement, the women's rights movement are also part of them. It's not to be vanguard of such movements, it is best to create a collaborative and joint campaign, because it is only the convergence of different different justice movements which can lead to change. We have been having these global days of actions around tax and gender for the last, this is the 6th edition. This year's global days of action takes place when the world is affected by a crisis triggered by the COVID pandemic. Maybe the health casualties have been relatively low in developing countries, but it does not mean that the consequences of the pandemic triggered crisis are less severe in developing countries. And as usual, when multiple crises happens, those who are underprivileged, those who are subjected to different types of inequality suffer the most. And in this case also, women are at the forefront of the fight against the pandemic induced crisis, but at the same time also they are the ones who are facing the gravest consequence of the crisis. I will not even dare to go deeper into the theme because we have assembled competent panelists in this session. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much to my colleagues also who have made it happen, and also for Nana for accepting the moderation. Thank you. Back to you, Nana.
Thank you so much, Dereje. Now on to the roundtable. So we have 7 experts from around the world, and I'm going to briefly introduce each one. So first up, we have Caroline Otim, and Caroline is the Global Policy and Campaigns Coordinator for Africa at the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And she's also co-chair of GATJ's Tax and Gender Working Group. Caroline is a Pan-African feminist economist and a gender specialist. She is also the thematic lead on tax and gender at GATJ, and she leads the global campaign on Make Taxes Work for Women. And that campaign advances the centrality of a caring economy. Caroline is passionate about tax and gender justice, and she works in policy and advocacy spaces to ensure that tax justice is a lived reality for all, particularly for women and girls everywhere. So Caroline, thank you for joining us. Next is María Felix Estrada. María Felix is Deputy Director of the Nicaraguan Institute for Tax Research and Studies and a representative of the Coordination Council of the Latin American Tax Justice Network. She's also a university professor and an opinion columnist. María Felix has a master's degree in public law from the Nicaraguan Institute of Legal Studies and a master's degree in international taxation from the Centro de Estudios Caribe in Spain. She is a postgraduate in government economics from the Universidad Nacional del Litoral in Argentina, and an expert in regulatory compliance against money laundering and terrorist financing from the International University for Sustainable Development. So María Felix, we are very pleased to have you with us today. We also have Erika Beauchesne, and Erika is the communications coordinator with Canadians for Tax Fairness, which is a nonprofit organization in Canada that advocates for fair and progressive taxes to reduce inequality, strengthen the economy, and fund quality public services. Erika, great to have you with us today as well. Next up is Ian Gary. And Ian is the executive director of the Fiscal, Accountability, and Corporate Transparency Coalition, the FACT Coalition. And that's a US-based civil society coalition of more than 100 members working to curb global corruption and to create a fair global tax system. Ian is a senior policy research and advocacy professional. He has over 25 years of experience in fiscal transparency and accountability, international development, and the reform of natural resource governments. So Ian, thank you so much for being with us today. We are also very happy to have Farah Nguegan, and Farah is currently serving as communication manager at the Tax Justice Network Africa. She has authored several publications, including one entitled Lack of Human Capital in Resource-Rich Africa, The Real Paradox, and Great Insights, which is EC PDM's magazine. And she's also written a book on the dynamics of regional integration within African Union. So Farah, very lovely to have you with us today. We are also joined by Tove María Ryding. And Tove is the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Tax Justice at the European Network on Debt and Development, or Eurodad. And Eurodad is a network of 59 non-governmental organizations from 28 European countries working on issues related to development finance. The aspect of tax and gender is an integral part of Eurodad's work and the objectives the organization is aiming to achieve. Eurodad also coordinates Tax Justice Europe, which is the European regional member of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And Tove has been a member of the coordinating committee of GATJ since 2013. So a key part of Eurodad's tax work is monitoring and influencing of tax-related processes at global and regional levels, including the United Nations and the European Union. And during her time in Eurodad, Tove has coordinated several key reports on European tax policies, including survival of the richest and tax games, race to the bottom. And last but not least, we have Huang Fang Tao. And Thao is the representative of ActionAid ActionAid International in Vietnam. And Thao is in charge of leading an anti-poverty program that serves over 100 partners at all levels, over 30 staff, both national and expatriates, reaching more than 300,000 direct beneficiaries on the ground on an annual basis. And ActionAid works extensively in remote and difficult regions of Vietnam, addressing the issues of poverty and injustice, both in rural and urban areas. ActionAid Vietnam also is an active member of the Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia Network and is currently a core member of GATJ's Tax and Gender Working Group. So Tove and Thao, thank you so much for joining us today. And to all of our panelists, we are really lucky to have your expertise. So I'm going to ask you all one question at a time. Each panelist will have an opportunity to answer. And I just ask that you keep your replies to 2 to 3 minutes per question so we can get to everyone. So with that, I'm going to kick off our discussion with a broad overview question. And that is that economic challenges differ from country to country and from region to region. So could you each provide us with an overview of how tax systems have been impacting women in your region, especially now during this COVID-19 triggered economic crisis? So with that, I guess we can start with Caroline.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you so much. I'm excited really to be part of this panel conversation today, to be able to expound on the issue of tax and women's rights. And as you've clearly put it, really, taxation and tax systems are an important issue for women's rights, because every other day we see tax laws continuing to shape women's lives, affect their access to property, incomes, and even public services that governments provide. Your question is more specific to regions and countries. I would want to give it a more broader outlook, a global perspective. And so by that, I'd start by saying that when taxes affect women, taxes are crucial because of a number of reasons. One, because governments use taxes to raise revenue in order to be able to fund public services. Number two is for redistribution, to be able to address poverty and inequality, including gender inequality and other multiple discriminations. So globally, we see a number of countries, especially from the global south, being unable to raise enough resources, being unable to generate enough tax revenue in order to be able to fund their public services. And when this happens, it's because of the broken international tax system that allows for harmful tax practices to be practiced by multinational companies, illicit financial flows leaving countries, especially in the global south. And when this happens, it deprives governments of the required resources to be able to fund public services. And when this happens, it's women who are disproportionately affected. Number two, the way taxes are collected is also an important area to look at, because the way taxes are collected, particularly consumption taxes, disproportionately places a higher tax burden on women, because women usually form a higher majority within those living in poverty and those earning lower incomes. So when governments use consumption taxes to raise revenue, they predominantly affect women. But you've also mentioned an important aspect. Looking at the socioeconomic crisis triggered by the pandemic, how do we see taxes affecting women? And I'll say that, as in all crises, really, women have been at the forefront of fighting this particular pandemic, in building community resistance, in building trust with public institutions, but more importantly, in ensuring that women's perspectives and the engagement of marginalized communities continue to happen. And therefore, their perspectives are quite critical to building forward better, a world that is more inclusive, more equal, and resilient, even post the pandemic, and not really building back better as we've had before. So it's building forward better. And today, I'd like to also emphasize, as Dereje has mentioned, as we kick off the campaign on Make Taxes Work for Women, it's important to note that women, particularly those living in poverty in the global south, those facing intersecting discriminations, really have borne the greatest burden of this pandemic. when we see weak health systems because of decades of underfunding. And this has, of course, exacerbated the threats of the disease itself. We are looking at an increased number of gender-based violence meted at women and girls. We are seeing women and girls losing their sources of income, and girls having limited access to education, and of course, the increased unpaid care work within the whole context. And so what the pandemic has really taught us is that despite governments across the world committing to address gender inequalities, discrimination, and biases in tax policies through various mechanisms, a lot still needs to be done to reframe the economic and tax system to make it work for women. And the pandemic has also taught us that the current extractive, neoliberal, neocolonial, and patriarchal economic models and tax system are really what have created the systemic and structural inequalities, including gender inequality that you're talking about now, that really needs to be addressed with the utmost urgency. We see decades of austerity and privatization continue to undermine the accessibility, the affordability of public services, including public health and other social services. And it's really women who are bearing the brunt of all this. And it is important to note that the pandemic, its responses and recovery needs to be centered on a feminist framework that responds to issues feminism. We see women forming a majority of the healthcare workers. They are at the front lines, they're exposed. And most of the time, they're also underpaid and overworked. We see them at home carrying unpaid care work. How do governments really move forward without this critical mass of the population being part and parcel of the conversation of tax? So I think taxation and tax systems are a very important issue that we need to look into for governments and multilateral institutions to be able to realize tax justice for women's rights and for the sustainable development goals to also be realized. I'll leave it there, Nana.
Caroline, thank you for that very powerful and broad overview. We really appreciate that. Now, next, Erika, I would love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Thanks, Nana. Even before the pandemic, unfair tax practices have been harmful to women in Canada. Lost tax revenues due to tax dodging, tax loopholes, corporate tax cuts have drawn government resources away from public services that support women. Just as we're seeing elsewhere, the pandemic has definitely made things worse. Canadian women have been more likely to lose work, more likely to shoulder more of the care burden, and also less likely to return to work. So in Canada, there's actually an expression that's really taken off now called the she session. That's a term that Canadian economist has termed to describe the unequal impact the pandemic has had on women. And as many have pointed out, we cannot have a recovery without a she-covery. So we really need to strengthen supports for women, and we can afford to do that with tax justice. We're seeing, again, like elsewhere here in Canada, we're seeing that the effects of the pandemic are much more pronounced among women who are lower income workers, among visible minorities, and among single mothers as well. So it's not only exacerbated existing gender inequalities, but also inequalities of race and of wealth. And on the other side, we're actually seeing that those at the top are doing quite well. We released a report late last year that found that 44 of Canada's billionaires, all of whom are men, grew their wealth by 53 billion in the pandemic. So the recovery plans from government really need to address this uneven recovery. We need progressive taxes to target the extreme concentration of wealth at the top, and we need to use those revenues to strengthen social programs that directly benefit women, particularly women from lower income households who have been most affected by the pandemic. And we can do this through investments in areas such as childcare, which is expensive and difficult to access in many Canadian cities, and through investments in other social programs such as affordable housing and national pharmacare. Canada has healthcare, but it's not truly universal in that it doesn't cover many medicines or dental work. And so especially at a time when people have lost work and lost coverage, we really need to improve those social programs, those public services, to help those to help lower income women and other households.
I really love that point that you made, that we cannot have a recovery without a she-covery. That is definitely a tenet to keep in mind globally. Now, María, Felix, I would love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Buenos días, es un gusto estar compartiendo con todas y todos en esta oportunidad en representación de América Latina. Bueno, todos evidentemente alrededor del mundo sabemos que nuestros sistemas tributarios han sido regresivos y no han impactado de buena manera en el desarrollo de las mujeres. En el caso específico de América Latina, incluso antes de la pandemia, ha tenido grandes deudas sociales y unos déficits gigantescos en materia de garantizar los derechos económicos, sociales, culturales de las mujeres. Inclusive esto ha permitido aumentar la brecha en la desigualdad de género, por lo cual en nuestra región existen múltiples desafíos en materia de autonomía económica, la calidad del empleo, la protección social, del cuidado, la salud, como mencionaba Caroline también en su intervención. La violencia de género es uno de los factores que afecta mucho en América Latina, sobre todo por la trata de personas o el narcotráfico. Y además, las mujeres tienen una escasa participación social y política en materia de liderazgo. Bien, recordemos que en América Latina la baja recaudación lo que ha provocado es una menor inversión en beneficios sociales, entiéndase educación, salud, incluso generaciones de nuevas oportunidades de empleo, lo que ha ido sumiendo en la pobreza a muchos hogares. Y estos hogares en América Latina están liderados por mujeres debido a que existe una marcada mala costumbre de que los hombres generalmente no están presentes en el hogar. Bien, además en América Latina tenemos sistemas tributarios muy complejos que generalmente otorgan beneficios fiscales o exoneraciones para empresas multinacionales o también denominadas extranjeras, en las cuales se aprueban exoneraciones de impuestos de manera indefinida o por un muy largo tiempo. Estas compañías generan trabajo, es cierto, pero generan un trabajo precario en donde las principales trabajadoras son mujeres y no reciben ni un trato digno, tampoco un salario adecuado al trabajo que realizan. Y esto sumado a la falta de reconocimiento del trabajo doméstico o del cuidado que ejercen las mujeres en los hogares, pues va mermando la brecha de la desigualdad y la oportunidad que pudieran tener de crecer. En cuanto a la pandemia, me gustaría remitirme a algunos aspectos que desde la Red Latinoamericana de Justicia Fiscal hemos logrado identificar que ha afectado principalmente a las mujeres post pandemia o durante la pandemia. Número uno fue que cuando estalló la pandemia se generó un pánico absoluto, desencadenando el desempleo de muchas mujeres que estaban sobre todo en este tipo de trabajos que, aunque eran formales, eran un tipo de trabajo no tan bien remunerado. Sin embargo, pasaron de estar en trabajo precario en el desempleo absoluto, lo cual evidentemente repercute en sus hogares, en los niños y en las economías familiares. En segundo lugar, hubieron quienes pudieron también mantener su trabajo, pero con reducciones salariales significativas. Es decir, que esto afectó evidentemente la calidad de vida de las mujeres y de sus familias. Y además, algo que no se habla mucho es el aumento de los gastos en el hogar producto del trabajo remoto. En América Latina, no todas las empresas han aprobado un paquete adicional de beneficios para las trabajadoras, debido a que en realidad están incurriendo en más gastos por internet, energía eléctrica, etcétera, que evidentemente es una asunción de gastos de la empresa. Luego también me gustaría enfocarme en la parte de que se iniciaron un sinnúmero de negocios informales, que estos negocios no pagan impuestos. Y aquí debemos de tener mucho cuidado porque tiene dos afectaciones. Número uno, tenemos menor recaudación de este tipo de negocios debido a que las administraciones tributarias no pueden fiscalizar este tipo de actividades que se está dando de manera informal y también virtual en América Latina. Y número dos, también que no permite controlar a las personas que están trabajando en este tipo de negocio, y eso puede dar pie a fomentar los flujos financieros ilícitos también. Mucho se está utilizando incluso los pagos virtuales, los pagos mediante criptomonedas, y todo este tipo de cosas no permite garantizar las condiciones mínimas de las mujeres en este tipo de trabajo. Otra de las cosas que también hemos visto en América Latina es la implementación de medidas de austeridad en los presupuestos públicos. Bajo el argumento de la necesidad de cubrir la pandemia, en América Latina hemos visto cómo se ha efectuado una reducción a las garantías mínimas de acceso a salud, por ejemplo, con el énfasis de que hay que garantizar la protección de los enfermos de la COVID-19. Entonces, todo esto ha venido a mermar los derechos de las mujeres, generando inclusive el aumento de las tasas de mortalidad, no solo en el caso de mi país, de Nicaragua, sino que también a lo largo de la región centroamericana. Evidentemente, la pandemia ha generado un incremento en las tareas de las mujeres en el hogar, incluso para atender las tareas de los niños, el cuidado de los enfermos, y sumado al trabajo que ya tenían que realizar en sus distintas actividades económicas. Y todo esto no lo vemos que esté recogido dentro de los presupuestos públicos. Las políticas públicas en América Latina no estaban preparadas a como ningún país, creo, del mundo estaba preparado, ¿verdad?, para una pandemia con esta magnitud. Sin embargo, la pobreza es cada día más evidente en América Latina, y esto está mermando las garantías, las pocas garantías que quizás ya teníamos las mujeres en el desarrollo económico. Muchas gracias.
María, Felix, thank you so much for that overview, and especially your very important point that within Latin America, there are some very complex tax systems, and that is allowing multinationals to operate using these tax exemptions and benefits almost indefinitely. And that has a very real world impact that needs to be further explored. So thank you for that. Next up, Farah, would love to hear your thoughts.
Ce séminaire est la preuve par excellence que le problème auquel on fait face est vraiment global. Et je vais embrayer sur ce qu'a soulevé Caroline, le sous-financement de la politique santé, et embrayer aussi sur ce que María, Felix a soulevé, c'est-à-dire les multinationales qui profitent des failles du système fiscal pour dégager des ressources colossales. Comment ça se traduit sur le continent africain? Les Africains sont affectés de plusieurs manières par les politiques fiscales injustes, mais nous ne prendrons que le malheureux exemple de la santé. 90% des Africains sont affectés de manière directe ou indirecte par les politiques fiscales injustes. 90% des Africains sont affectés de manière directe ou indirecte par les politiques fiscales injustes. 90% des Africains sont affectés de manière directe ou indirecte par les politiques fiscales injustes. les politiques fiscales inadaptées de nos pays créent des déserts médicaux qui, à leur tour, réduisent l'accès aux soins de santé. Quand nos États n'investissent pas les impôts prélevés dans la construction d'hôpitaux, les femmes se retrouvent à payer le prix fort. Selon l'OMS, en 2006, à cause de l'absence de soignants qualifiés et donc d'hôpitaux, 50 millions d'accouchements ont eu lieu à domicile. Vous vous imaginez 50 millions d'accouchements à domicile parce qu'il n'y a pas d'hôpitaux à proximité? Si l'État ne soutient pas le système de santé, c'est de cela que Caroline parlait. Quand les États n'investissent pas ou sous-financent la santé, la loi de l'offre et de la demande règne aux grandes dames de ceux qui n'ont pas les moyens. Est-ce que vous savez que dans certains pays africains, une femme qui va accoucher peut débourser jusqu'à l'équivalent de $1000 américains. Quand tu n'as pas les moyens, tu es une femme qui va accoucher, tu fais comment? Donc, la faible présence des hôpitaux liée au prix élevé des soins de santé ne peuvent qu'aggraver la mortalité maternelle. Et vous avez déjà lu pas mal de littérature sur la question. Mais pour vous donner un chiffre choquant, au Niger, une femme sur 7 meurt à cause des complications liées à la grossesse. Ce sont les chiffres de l'OMS. Donc, on a l'État qui investit peu dans la santé, comme Caroline l'a mentionné plus haut, mais on a aussi les multinationales qui profitent des cadeaux fiscaux énormes. Donc, quand on prend l'exemple du Zimbabwe, on a un déficit aussi énorme dans la santé. Qu'est-ce que l'État applique? Élargissement de l'assiette fiscale, c'est-à-dire encore plus de taxes, augmentation de la TVA, tenez par exemple sur les transports. Donc, imaginez cette femme qui va accoucher, l'hôpital est à 10 km et on a augmenté le prix du pétrole que les transporteurs vont répercuter sur le prix du transport. Donc, cette femme-là va se retrouver à payer un prix plus cher pour prendre son transport pour aller accoucher à des kilomètres. Imaginez le niveau d'injustice fiscale à cause d'une politique inadaptée. Deuxièmement, pendant qu'on augmente la TVA, c'est-à-dire les plus pauvres payent, y compris les femmes, on réduit le taux d'imposition des sociétés. En d'autres termes, c'est comme si on demande à une société de production de serviettes hygiéniques de ne pas payer d'impôts, mais on demande à la personne qui va acheter les serviettes hygiéniques de payer le prix 3 fois, 4 fois plus cher. Je vais donner un exemple très concret. Est-ce que vous savez que le Zimbabwe, cette année, a pris des mesures autorisant, tenez-vous bien, les entreprises étrangères à être les seuls propriétaires de leurs mines, c'est-à-dire il n'y a pas 50% pour l'État zimbabwéen et 50% pour l'entreprise, c'est 100% l'entreprise qui est propriétaire. Donc, propriétaire exclusif de la mine, les mines et les investisseurs étrangers ont la capacité de rapatrier la totalité de leurs bénéfices vers leur pays d'origine, c'est-à-dire un seul franc ne reste pas au Zimbabwe. Et en plus de cela, et c'est de ça que María, Felix parlait, ces compagnies bénéficient de 5 ans au Zimbabwe, 5 ans de vacances fiscales, pas d'impôts. Imaginez les millions auxquels le Zimbabwe renonce alors que le système de santé a par exemple besoin d'investissement. C'est un exemple parmi tant d'autres qui montre à quel point sur le continent africain, les politiques de fiscales inadaptées touchent les femmes et qui en profitent les multinationales et les femmes n'en profitent pas. Voilà un peu pour rester vraiment aérien parce qu'il y a beaucoup à dire sur la question.
Hey, Farah, thank you so much for that very comprehensive overview and really drilling down into how the health impacts of the pandemic extend far beyond COVID-19. Very, very helpful for all of us to hear about. Next up, Ian, I would love to hear your comments.
Thanks, Nana, and thanks to the Global Alliance for Tax Justice for inviting me to represent the FACT Coalition and our work in the United States. I think a lot of what I'm going to say is quite similar, even though the US might be different economically than a lot of the countries that we've been talking about. But the US tax code often has invisible gender and racial bias. And over the last few years, we've seen real declines in the progressivity of taxes in the US that starve our government of resources needed to invest in gender justice. As I was working to prepare my remarks, I really relied on the National Women's Law Center, which has done excellent work examining the gender and other biases embedded in our tax code. And our tax code really assumes a lot about what family structures, marriage, participation in the workforce looks like. And it's created, largely written by a small group of privileged white men. Our modern tax code is from 1939 and was really based on the idea that it was an employed husband, a caregiver wife, and children. And very few families now meet this model. But we still have a tax code where, for example, if you have one spouse earning more than the other, you get a lower tax rate. This is called a marriage bonus. But in couples in which the spouses earn equal incomes, you don't receive a marriage bonus. There are other ways that our tax system discriminates against women. For example, our tax laws offer business expense deductions and generous tax breaks for capital-intensive businesses. But women tend to own more service-oriented firms in our country and receive little support from tax laws. Men hold more wealth and are paid more, are better positioned to save and invest compared to women, and the majority of tax breaks for savings go to men. The low effective tax rates that we have for richer households widens pay and power disparities between executives, who are more often men, and poorly paid workers, who are more often women and people of color. That means that people with high incomes and companies with capital really have wealth and power to exert over the rules of our economy. When you look at our tax code, most recently the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017, this greatly benefited the wealthy and corporations. And if you look at tax enforcement, another important issue, our Internal Revenue Service has had its funding slashed over the last decade. This has meant that while large companies and rich individuals are now less likely to be audited, the poor taxpayers are continuing to bear the brunt of IRS's remaining capacity. And somebody making $20,000 and receiving the earned income tax credit is as likely to be audited as if you were making $400,000. Recently, Chai-Ching Huang, who is the executive director of the Tax Law Center at New York University, she highlighted all these issues about enforcement and showed that even last year, the IRS had failed to follow up with more than 369,000 high-income households that didn't even file a tax return. So while poor working women who receive the earned income tax credit are being audited at a very high rate, rich individuals who don't even file a tax return are not being followed up by the IRS. Another issue for us that we've been working on is corporate secrecy. The US is the easiest place to set up anonymous shell companies, and these have an impact on women. For example, some sources of illicit financial flows facilitated by anonymous shell companies include sex and human trafficking, and they also aid in tax avoidance. When you look at the COVID context, I think the issue of the she recession, as highlighted by others, has really played out in the US. And in the US, we often say that other countries have safety nets and the US has women. And this is what we've seen during the pandemic crisis. And this has only been exacerbated. Women and their families who are already treading water are now bearing the brunt of this crisis. And over the course of the first 10 months of the pandemic, women, particularly women of color, have lost more jobs than men, as industries dominated by women have been hit the hardest. Meanwhile, the wealth of the country's top titans, tech titans such as Bill Gates, Microsoft, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, the top richest men in the country have gained more than $360 billion in just the past year, which is almost as much as the government spent in the last round of stimulus checks. So Nana, in the next round of questions, I'll talk about what we can do about this situation.
Ian, thank you for those excellent points, especially the points you raised on audit and enforcement. I know that it's being discussed in the public sphere, but I don't think it gets enough attention. So hopefully that is something that policymakers will turn more attention to. as we try and dig ourselves out of the pandemic. Now, Thao, on to you. Would love to hear your remarks.
Hello?
Hi, Thao, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry. Okay, first, thanks, colleagues, for giving me this chance of sharing the situation that we have been observing and struggling with in Vietnam and in Asia in general. Even before COVID-19, Asia, especially ASEAN countries, are the area where most of the garment and shoes are made with women workers in the factories and in the sweatshops. We have so many research in different countries and all showing the same thing. The conditions of working condition for those workers are really bad. Despite the fact that the different brands and different struggles from the consumers all over the world, situation has not changed so much. And that links clearly to the race to the bottom by so many countries in ASEAN, trying to give as much as possible incentives to foreign direct investors to stay in their countries. And by doing that, the first choice is just to weaken the labor protections, to weaken the social protections for the workers. So specifically in Vietnam, with our research done with about 10,000 migrant workers working both in the factory and outside of the factory in garment and textile sector, it showed that 87% of them experience sexual harassment, and about 60% of them are not having any support to care for their children while they're at work. At the same time, our country, Vietnam, is giving up about 50,000 trillion Vietnamese dong, which is about 20% of our national budget, annual national budgets, as tax incentive. And that is alone enough to pay the whole annual salary for 35,000 nurses, or enough to pay to build all new schools for one province in country. So the race is really highly competitive here, and the government must change. I guess the previous speakers was touching very important issues, both at micro and macro level. But I want to emphasize the situation of the workers, the women workers. We are also seeing that very little has been spent on the gender responsive public services, which allowed the inequality on unpaid care work happening. So unpaid care work to all countries in ASEAN are still very invisible, both at the macro policy as well as tax and fiscal policy. We have been working together and asking for more investment from the government to ensure that more spending on healthcare, education, childcare, and especially universal social protection for all, to make sure that women will not suffer from harmful tax policies in these countries. Yeah, and be stopping there. Thank you.
Right. Thao, thank you for that very important point about the global race to the bottom for foreign direct investment. I mean, that's huge, and it's something that needs to be immediately addressed because we're seeing a lot of pretty quick movement on that. Now, Tove, last but not least, would love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Yes, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. And thank you first to all my co-panelists for a lot of very interesting inputs. Yeah, I think we in Europe, we see a lot of the same dynamics, as especially Ian and Erika highlighted for Canada and the United States. We have a lot of the same, that the wealthiest part of the population is getting even wealthier, while we're seeing inequality, and especially the most vulnerable parts of our societies being more hit by the crisis. And we also have some tax laws with obvious gender discriminations, like Ian mentioned, the marriage bonus, which is a bonus for the highest income earner, normally the man, and it's a bonus perhaps for the couple as a whole, but it's not a bonus for the lowest income earner, because whoever earns least actually gets a lower part of the income compared to what they would have had if there wasn't a joint taxation of the couple. And that keeps women off the job market. It simply reduces the incentives for women to work. So we still have that in some EU countries. It's very much the same dynamics. But we have something else in Europe as well. And it speaks a bit to the question, instead of saying how tax policies are affecting women in my region, I would also say, how are tax policies in my region affecting women all over the world? Because we heard a lot about the impacts around the world. And we had, for example, Farah and María both mentioning that one reason why we have these regressive tax systems is because it's still very difficult today to make multinational corporations pay their share of tax. And that's an area where Europe stands out a bit as well. In Europe, we have some of the most aggressive countries when it comes to both the race to the bottom on corporate taxation, offering harmful tax practices that allow multinational corporations not just to lower their tax rates in that country, but also allows them to shift profits to that country from other countries. So we're seeing some European countries where there's more corporate profit than you would expect if you look at how much corporate activity there is. And at the same time, we still have a number of creative tax practices that allow these corporations to pay very little tax. Now, of course, there's two sides to this problem. On the one hand, we need a global system that stops this. And on the other hand, we also need countries to stop trying to find every possible loophole they can to help corporations pay less tax. But also when it comes to the global solutions, and I think here also the Global Alliance has been extremely active. When it comes to the global solutions, for example, the civil society proposals to say we need a tax negotiation at the United Nations that doesn't just look at tax, but puts it in the context of human rights and women's rights and the sustainable development goals. Of course, one of the key reasons that we haven't been able to get that UN tax negotiation yet is because the European countries come out very strongly and say, no, we don't think there should be a UN tax negotiation, and fights very hard to keep the process to set the global tax rules in the OECD, in Europe, in fact, because the negotiations still take place in Paris. So we're seeing Europe play a role at the global level that is quite unfortunate, because when we can't tax the profits of multinational corporations, governments start looking elsewhere. And if they would look to the private wealth in developing countries, and they would look to the big fortunes, they would have the problem that those fortunes move around as well. And they also still use secrecy jurisdictions to avoid taxation in the home countries of the wealthy individuals. Also here, we still have mechanisms in Europe that help wealthy individuals to hide their fortunes. We're a bit further along than the United States, but we're not where we need to be. And the last point I wanted to make was that during the COVID crisis, when it started last year, we saw a lot of corporate bailout packages. We saw governments in Europe stepping in and trying to save corporations and, of course, save jobs. But then came the discussion that some of these corporate bailout packages were actually being awarded to large multinational corporations. And the question came up about how can we make sure that these corporations are then not avoiding taxes? And so there was a debate in Europe back and forth. And unfortunately, the conclusion we landed at is that we can't. We still don't have the transparency to check that multinational corporations actually pay taxes where they do business. And we're discussing right now whether we should have this so-called public country-by-country reporting in Europe. But we still don't have it. So the corporations received big bailout packages. And hopefully someday we'll be able to check how many of those corporations are actually also paying their share of taxes. But we're not there yet. So we still have some homework to do here in Europe.
Tove, thank you so much for those remarks and for your focus on, really building a global system. That segues into my next question for the roundtable. So how is it exactly that tax justice can help advance gender equality? And here, I would love to hear perhaps some different demands or solutions that draw on everyone's specific advocacy work, whether that is transparency, working towards a UN tax body, etc. So with that, Caroline, I would love to start with you.
Thanks, Nana. So how can tax justice advance gender equality? As I said at the beginning, tax has a very important role of ensuring that there's redistribution of wealth within the economy. And so if provision of services is one of those ways of reducing inequality and poverty, of course, through taxation. And also currently, when we look at the current aid arena, that pool is shrinking every other day. And tax is really one of the most sustainable ways that governments can be able to use to raise domestic resources in the most reliable manner in order to resource women's rights. And so it's important that tax is designed in a way that really addresses gender inequality, as we've seen other panelists also mention. So the way really tax systems are designed and implemented have a direct impact on who they benefit and also on who they unfairly burden. And so tax justice is quite necessary to ensure that governments are able to fulfill their human rights obligations, particularly women's rights in this context. And as Tove also mentioned, around international cooperation on tax issues, that is a very important point to ensure that illicit financial flows, other harmful tax practices is something that is dealt with in an intergovernmental UN global tax body where all countries have a seat on the table and they contribute to the global standard setting on an equal footing. It's really important to democratize the efforts to curb illicit financial flows so that it's not really dominated by northern countries, but to have all countries, particularly from the global south, on the table. The current scenario that we are seeing is quite tokenistic, And so this really is something that needs to change for us to be able to address issues tax and to ensure that tax justice is a reality. Number two is around having a just feminist economy. And of course, when we have this in place, we will ensure that there's reduced time burden for care work. There'll be more secure incomes for women, and tax justice, of course, will provide the sufficient resources to fund public services, be able to achieve the highest attainable levels of healthcare, be able to have girls go to school, and ensure that women's safety and ability to engage even in political activities is something that really is a reality. And so even for the Global Days of Action that is currently happening, the campaign itself, we are seeing the women's movement and the tax justice movement really joining hands in order to be able to address the issue on the table, that tax justice really needs to be a reality, because there's really no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. Thanks, Nana.
Thank you, Caroline. With that, Farah, would love to hear your remarks.
Juste pour embrayer sur ce que Caroline vient de dire. Une des manières d'atteindre la justice fiscale, c'est de passer par les conventions de non-double imposition. C'est-à-dire, la plupart des États africains signent des accords de non-double imposition avec les États. Il n'y a aucun problème dans les accords de non-double imposition en eux-mêmes. Mais lorsque le Kenya signe un accord de non-double imposition avec l'île Maurice et un paradis fiscal, les deux perdent. Parce que vous savez que les nationales s'emploient à exploiter toutes les failles du système qui peuvent exister. Donc, si au niveau du Kenya, le national peut échapper aux taxes kenyanes, tout en sachant qu'elle ne paiera rien en île Maurice, croyez-moi, elle va profiter de implémenter les différentes mesures qui vont permettre une justice fiscale pour tous, y compris fasse un effort pour que les conventions de non-double imposition soient les plus équitables et permettent de générer des revenus pour les États africains. Merci.
C'est avec mon audio.
It looks like we have lost Farah, her connection. We'll see if we can return to her. But in the meantime, Ian, would love to hear some of your thoughts on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Nana. I think it's a really exciting time, and there are real opportunities to address some of the problems that I mentioned in the US this year. One of the first things that the Biden administration did was issue a new executive order on addressing inequality. And I think it's important to note that you can't fix problems if you can't see them. And our government needs to be able to see the problems that we're discussing. This executive order notes that federal data are not disaggregated by race, ethnicity, gender, disability, income, or other demographic variables, and that this lack of data has effects and impedes efforts to measure and advance equity. A first step to promoting equity in government action is to gather the data necessary to inform that effort. So it's really exciting to see that right out of the gate, the Biden administration is forming an interagency working group on equitable data. And this will apply across all government agencies, including the Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service. So it'll be interesting to see the new data that we get on how our tax code affects different races, different genders and other demographic variables. In terms of what the FACT Coalition is doing, we're really working to make sure that corporations pay their fair share, to try to make our tax code more progressive and to generate resources to invest in gender justice. Just last week, the US Congress introduced the No Tax Breaks for Outsourcing Act. The current law guarantees that multinational companies will pay at most 1/2 the domestic rate in federal taxes on their offshore earnings. The No Tax Breaks for Outsourcing Act would provide a simple, straightforward fix to one of the costliest problems created by the 2017 tax cuts legislation, and would eliminate the deep discount multinational companies get for shifting profits offshore. FACT and the Americans for Tax Fairness organized a sign-on letter with 90 groups, including the National Organization for Women, to pass this important legislation this year. We're also promoting, as Tove mentioned, increased public country-by-country reporting. And while single mothers get audited, multinational companies can shift profits to avoid taxes. Public country-by-country reporting would shine a light on these aggressive tax avoidance strategies. And we believe that there's an opportunity to get new regulation on multinational companies through the Securities and Exchange Commission rulemaking process as part of a broader process to create new environmental, social, and governance disclosures that could also, for example, disclose information on a company level about gender and racial pay disparities, or the workforce makeup along gender lines. Another big issue for FACT is the implementation of the newly enacted Corporate Transparency Act, which will end anonymous shell companies in the United States. So this is a priority for us in the coalition, and will be an important advance to addressing the use of anonymous shell companies. Also in Congress, there are other important new tax proposals. For example, Senator Elizabeth Warren has introduced the Ultra Millionaire Tax Act, which would tax the top 0.05%, asking them to pay their fair share for the recovery. And she says this legislation would raise more than $3 trillion over the next 10 years. It's also important to note that the idea of taxing the wealthy has popular support in the US. And a Reuters poll last year found that nearly 2/3 of respondents agree that the very rich should pay more. Around enforcement, an issue I mentioned earlier, there is also new legislation to provide our tax authority with $70 billion more over the next decade to allow the IRS to audit individuals making more than $1 million and corporations with more than $20 billion in assets. So this is really important to take care of the inequities in terms of how our tax system is enforced. Finally, I think it's really important to note that there are opportunities to invest in priorities for women in the US as we build back from the She session, as was mentioned earlier. The American Rescue Plan, passed only last week, creates more affordable health premiums for millions who've lost their jobs. It would expand Medicaid, which is the largest payer for women's health. And many low-income families will be eligible for a child tax credit, rising to $3,600 per child per year. And this is estimated to cut child poverty in half. These are only some of the examples of things that we can do to address the needs of women in the United States with greater tax revenue. Nana?
Thank you, Ian. Great point on public country-by-country reporting. Sometimes it can feel a little abstract, but as you mentioned, I mean, if we have more transparency, that might shine light on the fact that, you know, single mothers are audited at pretty high rates. Now, with that, on to María Felix. Would love to hear your input.
Sí, gracias. Bueno, creo que para poder entender hacia dónde avanzan nuestros sistemas fiscales hacia la igualdad de género, en el caso de América Latina, partiremos de la idea que estadísticamente las mujeres son alrededor del 50% de la población. Entonces, eso nos da una luz acerca de entender que por qué no tenemos políticas tributarias que garanticen la igualdad de género si prácticamente a nivel estadístico estamos casi igual. Otro de los factores que me gustaría retomar son algunos índices de desarrollo que ha publicado el Programa de Desarrollo de Naciones Unidas, el cual sitúa a América Latina en el 0.977% en este índice de desarrollo de género y además con un índice de desigualdad de género de 0.386%, es decir, de que estamos realmente en una situación muy mala en relación con el resto del mundo. Bueno, un sistema tributario debemos de recordar que es un instrumento de medición de la desigualdad y las brechas de género porque debe de garantizar políticas públicas equitativas y justas para sus ciudadanos, incluyendo obviamente a las mujeres, pero desde dos perspectivas. Uno, desde los ingresos, que es recaudación, y otra desde la aplicación del gasto, es decir, cómo esos recursos se están distribuyendo en las políticas públicas y recomendar a todos también de que los sesgos de género muchas veces no son perceptibles, no están expresamente en una ley, no están legibles en una política pública. Sin embargo, dentro de nuestras legislaciones y las políticas fiscales podemos ver ciertos casos que se ven de manera implícita. Ahora, es importante para poder avanzar hacia la igualdad de género que nuestros sistemas tributarios distribuyan los recursos que están recaudando de manera equitativa. Solo así podremos ver cómo se van generando los avances en materia social y económica para poder mejorar la calidad de vida de las mujeres en nuestros países. Con esto se permitiría establecer mejores condiciones para las mujeres y oportunidades también para su desarrollo personal y también que impactaría en las familias y obviamente en las economías locales. Mencionabas, Nana, de que diéramos algunos ejemplos. Yo creo que uno de los mecanismos que se puede implementar es evidentemente eventos como este de intercambio sobre las opiniones y las experiencias mutuas que estamos viviendo alrededor del mundo, porque la fiscalidad y el género son dos materias que cuesta entender cuál es su verdadera relación. Y esto lo hemos visto incluso con pláticas de movimientos feministas. Muchas veces creemos que el movimiento de igualdad de género debe ser enfocado únicamente hacia los derechos sociales, hacia los derechos políticos, pero existe una estrecha relación de la fiscalidad y el género que todavía considero que, por lo menos en el caso de América Latina, esto no ha sido comprendido a cabalidad. Por eso creo que debería de crearse campañas como esta. Es una herramienta fundamental que está teniendo una gran importancia alrededor del mundo y principalmente en América Latina para poder comprender. La ciudadanía común debe de entender con ejemplos prácticos cómo es que el sistema tributario está afectando a las mujeres. Y esto no podremos ver un cambio si no tenemos esa concientización en nuestra población como tal. Y yo insistiría en la creación y la continuidad, mejor dicho, de este tipo de campañas que van permeando luego a nivel regional y en cada uno de los países para poder difundir este tipo de conceptos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, María, Felix, for those remarks and for reminding us that, yes, I mean, essentially the work has started now in forums like this, and it will only continue to expand. So thank you so much for that. With that, Thao, would love to turn to you now.
Hello.
Hi, yes, we can hear you.
Hi. Okay, great. Yes, in terms of the progress that is being made at this level of the region and at the national level, there are very few evidence of countries joint collaboration to address the issues of tax, the race to the bottom. Despite the fact that NGOs in different countries in ASEAN are trying to lobby their own government at the same time talking at the ASEAN level to have a more coordinated mechanism for different countries in ASEAN to work together on tax. It has not been so successful. It is also because of the significant difference or inequality in different countries. So in ASEAN region, we have Singapore and Malaysia are among the richest countries, or with at least with a very high per capita income. But at the same time, we have countries like Laos, Myanmar, who are usually listed in the least developed countries. We have the rice exporter, #1 rice exporter, like Thailand and Vietnam, but we are also having #1 rice importer like the Philippines. So because of such a significant difference and inequality, there are a lot of conflict in how different countries see tax incentive into their investment for women development and shrinking the space of inequality. So I am trying to say that there are a lot more work for NGOs and the tax network members to do in this region. Let me stop there. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Thao. Now, Farah, we are very happy to have you back. Let's see if we can give you another try.
I hope this time it works.
It's perfect. It's good.
Great. Let me go back to French. It'll be more easy for me. So, j'étais donc en train de dire que la justice fiscale passe aussi par la mise en œuvre des conventions de non-double imposition équitable. Donc, pour accompagner toutes les mesures dont Caroline, María, Felix, Tove et même Thao ont parlé, les ressources financières peuvent continuer d'échapper à nos pays si nos conventions de non-double imposition sont inéquitables et signées avec les paradis fiscaux. Et c'est l'un des secteurs que Tax Justice Network Africa a investi ces dernières années, c'est-à-dire attaquer les conventions de non-double imposition qui permettent la fuite des flux financiers illicites par des failles. Nous avons par exemple traduit le gouvernement kenyan en justice pour son accord avec l'île Maurice et avons gagné, ça c'était en 2019. Et l'année passée, nous avons encore traduit le gouvernement kenyan par rapport à 10 autres conventions de non-double imposition, espérant que si le gouvernement kenyan revoit par exemple ses contrats avec le Qatar, la Corée, les Émirats arabes unis, l'Inde, les Pays-Bas, qui, je vous le rappelle, ont été listés parmi les pays qui permettent l'évasion fiscale et les flux financiers illicites par une récente étude de Tax Justice Network. Si nos pays revoient ça et suivent l'exemple du Kenya, il y a pas mal de fonds que nous allons récupérer pour réinvestir dans le développement durable de nos pays. Donc, en clair, les mesures où l'équité et la justice fiscale passent aussi par des conventions de non-double imposition qui sont équitables et maintiennent les fonds dans les pays où ils sont investis. Merci.
All right. Thank you so much, Farah. Much appreciated. Now with that, Tove, would love to turn to you.
Yes, thank you again. Well, I think first of all, the first thing to say is that we're already now feeling the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the momentum. We've seen so many horrible impacts as a result of the pandemic, but at least the politicians are starting to respond. And we saw that just a couple of weeks ago when suddenly there was a green light in the European Union to start negotiating a directive on this public country-by-country reporting. It's basically the question about whether ordinary citizens should be allowed to see where multinational corporations do business and what they pay in tax in each country where they operate. And this proposal has been stuck since 2016. And it's almost 5 years that we've been waiting for progress on this file. But now we're seeing it, and they're going to start the final phase of the negotiations later this month. So there is really a sign that we are going to see more momentum on tax issues now. However, a public country-by-country reporting would make us able to see the problem. But the question is again, then what do we do about it? Because of course, transparency will frighten some corporations into paying more taxes simply because they're afraid of the public outcry. But we've also seen some corporations be caught in scandals and have their tax avoidance exposed only to continue in the way they did before. So it's clear we're also going to need some regulation to lift the bottom for those who are most resilient to public pressure and common sense, you can say. And here I think there is one important negotiation going on right now, and that is the OECD-led negotiations on new global rules for corporate taxation in the digitalized economy. And the schedule right now is it's set to finalize the negotiations by July. And I think as we're getting closer to the deadline, there's more and more focus on whether it's going to be a deal or no deal. But in the context of fair taxation, it's also very important to look at what kind of deal is on the table. And it's exactly to go back to the perspective on how taxation impacts women, because if we take the perspective of a developing country, if we don't get global rules that ensures that it's possible for even the least developed countries to tax the multinational corporations in their countries, we're placing these developing countries in a difficult dilemma of either collecting too little tax, which means less public services, and that impacts women, or they can decide to take out more loans, which is a very short-term solution that's also, we've seen in studies, is also eventually going to impact women harder than men. Or they can choose regressive taxation. They can tax the citizens and the workers and the consumers, the people who are not able to hide their money internationally. But then we're stuck in this regressive taxation that again also impacts women harder. So it's extremely important that we get a solution to the global corporate tax avoidance. And unfortunately, the way it looks in the negotiations, there's generally two concerns that civil society organizations have raised. First of all, when we look at what's on the table, it doesn't look like it's going to solve the problem. We have the old transfer pricing system that is still going to continue. And then on top of that comes some new tax rules that are going to make the system even more complex. And we're even at the point where we're worried that maybe we'll see some new problems in addition to the old problems. And secondly, there's a problem with the fairness between developed and developing countries, especially when it comes to the minimum taxation rules that are being developed. We now seem to be looking at an outcome where the countries where multinationals are headquartered would have the first right to collect minimum taxes. And then the countries where corporations do business but don't have a headquarter would have a secondary right. And that is a clear discrimination against developing countries, because those are not the countries where corporations have primarily set themselves up. Also on this, we're also concerned that in the end, the rules might not be effective. So on all these fronts, it's summing up to a point where we're worried that, that these new global corporate tax rules, if they get adopted, that they won't solve the problem, and also they won't address the fairness question to make sure that even the least developed countries will be able to use the global tax rules to collect corporate taxes. And this, of course, brings us back to one of the demands that the civil society always are very committed to flagging, which is that there are so many issues that haven't been addressed in the OECD-led negotiations. There are so many proposals for alternative rules that were never discussed. And so that's why we're also still suggesting to have a United Nations negotiation about the global tax rules. And I'm cautiously optimistic. Also on this front, we're seeing more and more countries be interested in combating illicit financial flows. So, so we are seeing a growing momentum on this front as well. And this is definitely one of the issues that we'll be keeping a careful eye on in the coming months and years.
Thank you, Tove. There's definitely a lot of room for advocacy, excuse me, and movement, especially on the OECD BEPS 2.0 front within the next 4 months. So there's a lot of work that can be done. But lastly, we'd love to turn to you, Erika, and get your input on this.
Thanks, Nana. Yeah, like others have said, I think we're optimistic, and there's a number of campaigns that we're really focusing on here in Canada. One of them is combating tax haven use. In Canada, we know that we lose at least $8 billion a year to tax havens, but it could be as much as $25 billion. And those are revenues that are needed not only to support women here in Canada, but also to support women in other countries. A study by the Tax Justice Network last year found that Canada is responsible for $10 billion in tax losses in other countries, with poorer developing countries suffering the most. So our government really needs to do much more to tackle offshore tax dodging. And we're really pushing for reforms, not only to the international corporate tax system, but to make reforms here at home as well, including increasing corporate transparency, which is a real issue in Canada, where we have a lot of money laundering, or what's called snow washing here in Canada, where criminals can hide behind shell companies to launder money, to evade taxes. And we've been working with a number of organizations, Transparency International Canada, Publish What You Pay Canada, to really push for a public registry of beneficial owners, to help identify who is behind these shell companies. Another big issue here in Canada, this was mentioned by Ian, similar loopholes in our tax system here in Canada that pay out primarily, that benefit primarily men and the wealthiest. So we're really pushing to close those regressive and regressive and sexist tax loopholes. One study found that 4 out of 5 of personal tax loopholes in Canada provide greater benefits to men than to women. And we're talking about billions in revenues that could be used to help pay for the recovery, to help strengthen social programs to support women's needs. We're also really focused on targeting the extreme concentration of wealth at the top. I mentioned our billionaire report, which found the top 44 billionaires increased their fortunes during the pandemic. And this is part of a much larger trend that we've seen here in Canada, where the 1% now actually own a quarter of all wealth in the country. The federal NDP party, which is an opposition party here in Canada, has proposed an annual net wealth tax. And like Ian was saying, this is actually a really popular proposal. Polling both before the pandemic and after has found an overwhelming support of a wealth tax among Canadians, including even conservatives and higher incomes. So that's an issue that we're really pushing on as well. And then lastly, something that maybe doesn't get talked about as much, but we're advocating for ways to improve how the tax system works for women in Canada, where we have a number of really important social benefits that are delivered through the tax system, but that depend on people filing their taxes to receive those benefits. It's really important to improve how those benefits reach women who need them most, particularly lower income women and single mothers. So one reform that we've been advocating for many years now is to introduce automatic tax filing, an automatic tax filing system to help more women receive these benefits. And our government recently did commit to bring in automatic tax filing. So we're really hoping they follow through on that commitment, because it'll make a big difference to reducing poverty here in Canada. So those are some of the issues that we're really focused on. And as others have said, we're cautiously optimistic. We think there's a lot of momentum right now to really push governments to recognize that we need to address not only inequality, but raise revenues to help pay for the recovery.
Thank you so much, Erika, for that. Now, unfortunately, we have to conclude this portion of the roundtable. We didn't even get to all of the questions that we have. I feel like maybe we need to do a part 2. But to close, I would love to hear from Caroline as to how everyday individual people can get involved in this movement and, support all of this work that's currently being done on intersecting tax justice and women's rights. I know that will be very, very useful to our listeners.
Yeah, thank you, Nana. So I think having heard from all the panelists, it goes without saying that this is a very important issue that everybody needs to ensure their perspectives are put on the table and are heard by policymakers at all levels, be it at subnational level, be it national, regional, or global level. So everyone's voice really is something that is quite critical. And how people can get involved in this movement is that as the Global Alliance, we are a uniting front for the tax justice movement, bringing together 5 autonomous regions to work together to push for these demands that have been elaborated quite so eloquently during this panel. So we welcome different people, different organizations, different sectors to join this alliance, because we believe that as a collective, we can be able to achieve much more when we push together for a world that is a world that has tax justice on top of every agenda. This is really the time for different governments, for multilateral institutions to really ensure that tax reforms take root, because we have been taught by the pandemic that we really need not go back to where we were before, but to build a better world, not only for this generation, but for generations to come. So everyone is quite welcome to join in this struggle as we continually draw the plurality of voices across different regions of the world to join in the fight for tax justice. Thank you, Nana.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And to all of our panelists, thank you so much for your expert advice. I think we are all enriched by all of the very eloquent contributions you've all made today. So thank you again. Now with that, I'm going to hand off the mic to Dereje, and he will provide some final closing remarks, and that will conclude today's seminar.
Thank you very much, Nana. It was really a very interesting debate, and it's always very difficult to get on board people from all the continents because of the time differences. It's almost midnight now in some parts of Asia. As might have been noted, this is the first day of our 2 weeks long global days of action for making tax and recovery measures work for women. This is only the launch of the coming day. So we have a lot of materials on our website for all of you to get involved during this 2 weeks. It also coincides with the UN conference. There are a lot of activities we have been planning. We have materials which could be used by grassroots movements. We have materials which could be used by INGOs and all sectors involved in this. As I said at the beginning, we are not vanguards of anything, not even of tax justice. We are only a coalition in the broader justice movement. So what we are trying to achieve is to have, no movement can succeed as an issue movement. It has to be a collective action, and there should be convergence of all justice movements for a better world. So in that sense, thank you for being here today, and please join us in the next 2 weeks. We have a plan of having different activities. Unfortunately, the pandemic would not allow us to have street rallies, but there are lots of other means of expressing our demands and pushing for them. There are some meetings in which it could be this could be aired. So please join us, and thank you for attending today's session. And thank you very much, Nana, for ably moderating the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Enjoy your days.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day.